Hi, everybody. Happy Sunday morning. This is Memorial Day weekend, as we've already talked about, and it's one of those that's so interesting. It is important for us as people to remember what's happened before, what was done to get us where we are. And so before we get started today, I want to ask if you in the room have a family member or loved one that served and gave their life in the service, would you stand if we have anybody in here that's the case? We've had a few. Okay. All right. Awesome. Hey, we want to say thank you also. And I would just love to take a moment before we start and just pray for both of you and for those represented. Could we do that right now? Father, I thank you for people that hear the call with courage to go and sacrifice their lives for others. I thank you for, and we honor those who chose to pay that price. And we ask that for the loved ones, whether it's people in this room or those who served alongside and are dealing with the persistent but false guilt of being a survivor, I ask that you would be close, that your word would be true, that you are close to the brokenhearted and you rescue those who feel crushed. So would you do that now and have all of us see and seek you in this moment? In Christ's name, amen. Well, today's message is all about remembering. We're going to talk about the choice and the power of remembering. And it's interesting in our faith, we get called to remember so many things and so often. It's just a part of what makes us who we are. But even in our regular lives as humans, we are people who need reminders to remember, to make sure that we don't actively forget, and it's an active choice. So we do things like birthdays and anniversaries, and some of you have made the cardinal sin of forgetting an anniversary. And right now you're getting elbowed, so please just do it gently for those of you that are in that place. But we need the constant reminders of what's most important in our life, don't we? In our faith, as already mentioned, today is Pentecost Sunday. It's the birthday of not this church, but the church. When God, through the Holy Spirit, came and he caused Peter to preach this incredible message. And his message was all about the memory of all the things that God had done, what he had promised and what he had accomplished, and how good he was at that. In fact, Pastor Andy Stanley sums up his message like this, basically. You killed him, God raised him, we saw him, say you're sorry. And I think that's a pretty good summation of what it means to repent and trust, but to recall to mind what has taken place. Forgetfulness is such a common and deadly spiritual disease. So built into our calendar, we have things like remembering Passover. We remember, just like the people of God did earlier, remember the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, how God helped them in the wilderness. Today is Shavuot, which is the memory of the weeks, and it's the celebration of that Pentecost. And we do baptism. We had one in the first service this morning, a little girl named Seta. She has no idea what happened to her today. But one day, people are going to go, you need to know that you were loved by God before you even recognized him. And we do the Lord's Supper, our ultimate way of remembering. What I want to talk to you about today is why that's so important. This past week, I was looking at a couple of studies and surveys that were done about the problem of forgetfulness. And one of the things that I saw was really concerning. It was a study done on people in the United States under the age of 40 about the Holocaust. And here's what the survey found, that 63% of the 1,500 respondents didn't know that in the Holocaust 6 million Jews were killed. They didn't know. 48% of those couldn't name a single concentration camp or ghetto. And then ultimately 10% said they had actually never even heard the word Holocaust. Now, I don't say that or bring that up to throw shade on people under 40, because I don't think it's their fault. I think it's the rest of us who our job is to constantly remind and to tell the story of and to ensure that we don't have amnesia about those powerful moments. We have to pass on what is real and true, and so we just need a good reminder. In our text for today, we're going to be looking at something just like that. We're going to be looking in the book of Deuteronomy. Moses, the leader of the people, is giving his farewell speech. That's pretty much the whole book. And in it, he's going to tell these next group of people, this next generation, what they've got to hold on to and remember as they go into the promise of God. If you remember this, Moses was the leader who came to them. He led them out of their slavery in Egypt. He had to march them around the wilderness for 40 years because a bunch of them were complaining and grumbling, and God said, you're not getting in. We're going to start over fresh. So he waits till they all die off. And Moses' job has been really tough. He also is not going to make it in to the promised land. So he's got to hand this down well. And he does this through a speech that speaks to them all the things they have to keep in mind. This idea of keeping stuff ever before us is real important in the Christian faith. Some of our early fathers, some of the monks, used to have this practice. I've got this picture for you, this guy, monk in the Middle Ages, and you see, besides the super cool black hoodie, way before its time, but do you see what's there to his left? To our left, a skull. Monks would keep a skull on their desk as they copied the scriptures and wrote down to try to pass on to the next generation. They would have the skull there to remind them that their time on earth was short, that death comes for us all, so keep the main thing the main thing. They actually got that practice from a Roman Empire practice where when a conquering general would come back to Rome after victory and they were getting showered with praise and there was parades and they were a big deal like rock stars, when they would come back into the city, to all that pomp and circumstance, there would be a slave, and his one job was to follow right behind them and whisper in the general's ear, memento mori. Memento mori. It's Latin for remember death. Don't get caught up in believing your own press. The glory that you feel right now is short-lived, and there's something that's more important. That's the essence of what Moses is going to do with the people. So we're going to look at Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and chapter 8, two passages. I'm going to read them through. I'm going to make some comments afterwards, some things that I think should help us choose to remember well, and then I've got an invitation for you at the very end for how you can make this personal. So, Deuteronomy 6, starting in verse 10. Moses writes, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to you, a land with large, flourishing cities that you didn't build, houses filled with all kinds of good things that you didn't provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves you did not plant. Then when you eat and are satisfied, be careful. Be careful that you don't forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." Two chapters later, in chapter 8, verse 11, he says, "Be careful that you don't forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I'm giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, when your herds and flocks grow large and your silver and gold increase and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud. And you will forget the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." When things go well, when you have success and prosperity, you're going to be tempted to think, "Oh, I did a pretty good job." He said he led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, thirsty and waterless land with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of rock. He gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known, to humble and test you so that in the end it might go well with you. And you may say to yourself, "My power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me." But remember the Lord your God, for it's he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors as it is today. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Why should we choose to remember? Let me show you about 4 or 5 things from this passage. First, the reason that we choose is to honor those who came before. The very first thing that Moses does when he's trying to help this next generation be ready to live into all that God has is he recalls the faithful people from the past. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, these are heroes to them. And the reason that he does that is because as we honor those who've walked the path ahead of us, especially the path of faith, we tend to build in this appetite to emulate them. And we do this all the time in regular life too, you know? How many of you walk past like a basketball court at an elementary school, or somebody sets up a goal in the alley behind you and you see these kids, little kids that can barely get the ball up to the rim as they're shooting, and they're yelling out like, Stephen Curry, LeBron James. They don't look anything like that. Most of them will never be able to touch the net with their vertical jump, but we emulate and we try to imitate those that we honor. So Moses first says, look at those who've done it well. Focus on those people for a moment. And then he does not only to honor them, but also he says, remember in order to inspire. Did you catch all that part where he was talking about the land that was so productive and them sitting around a table with full bellies satisfied? When he says those words, the people have been stumbling around the desert for 40 years. They haven't had a good meal in decades. All they can actually remember is the slavery of Egypt, the burden on them, their inability to do anything for themselves. But he paints a picture of what the future can be. In fact, what it's going to be. It's the power to inspire by remembering what God's done in the past. And I think this is really, really important for us. I think most of us live lives that are pretty uninspired. Pretty much just regular, wake up, do it again, monotony, routine, and don't tap into the greatest picture of what the world can and will be that any group of people has ever had. We have it. As Christians, we have the grandest vision for the world. We know not only how God is going to be with us in this moment, but we are told how the story ends. And yet sometimes we choose to forget that. So he says, I want to inspire you with a bigger vision. You're going to need it for what comes next. Then he says, remember in order to instruct. He says, be careful that you don't forget the Lord. Don't fail to observe his commands. This is a group of people that's going to have to know what is expected of them, what the rules and the laws are. And the only way they're going to get it is if the ones who came before hand it down. Have any of you ever had this experience where you broke a rule that you didn't actually know existed? Like, for me, I was thinking about when I was in college, in the summers in between semesters, I would come home and my dad would make us, my brother and I, work in a situation that would ensure that we went back to college in the fall. Any of you have parents who did that for you? And so we would go to work. I grew up in Louisiana. We went to work for the refineries during the summer. And the refinery situation there, it was super hot. We wore this stuff called Nomex that on purpose doesn't breathe. It's really, really good looking too. It's like a onesie for adults. And you had to be in this in the middle of this refinery, so you're sweating to death. It's hard, hard work. I got a picture of me and my brother from circa 1993 or so. That's us. Aren't those hard hats cool? So off to work with our igloos full of our little Vienna sausages and stuff to eat at breaks. And we go to work, and one summer we show up at PPG, and we're working the first 2-3 hours, and all we were qualified to do at that point was to like dig and move rocks and heavy things from one place to another. So that's what they gave us. And so we've got a pile of rocks, 2 shovels, and a wheelbarrow. And that morning we're just moving, we're working for hours. Well, it was probably like 45 minutes, but it felt really, really long. And we get a nice pile moved over here, and then all of a sudden, this stream of older guys on the job site goes past us. And they walk over and sit down. Well, we're trying to, impress. This is our first time there, so we keep working. And finally, one of the guys walks over, and he taps on the shoulder, and he's like, hey, college boy. I'm like, oh, man. Yes? And he's like, put the shovel down and come sit. I'm like, why? It's only like 8:45. And he's like, because we take a break right now, and you make the rest of us look bad if you don't sit down. So we're like kind of blowing him off, And finally, enough of them are like, seriously, we're going to use that shovel on you if you don't come sit. So we do. We have our little mustard and saltines and Vienna sausages, which you should try it. It's really good when it's hot. And we learned the price for breaking that rule, because when we got back after the break, somebody had taken all our rocks and thrown them all back over where they were, right? So we had to start over. But I learned a valuable lesson. always pay attention to the person with the biggest goatee on a job site. He's the one who knows. I broke a rule I didn't know existed. We have to teach, we have to instruct, and one of the ways we do it is by calling to mind stories of the past. This is how information has been passed down for centuries of human history. And it's interesting, do you know that one of the ways, in fact, the most important way that we learn, most of your behaviors to this day, you got in the first 3 years of life through imitation, through modeling, through observing your parents or somebody else, and you just practiced and did that same thing. It's called mimetic learning, M-E-M-E-T-I-C. Albert Bandura was a psychologist that first studied this, and he showed that almost all of our adult behaviors get cemented early. Do you see in that mimetic the word meme? You know what this is? You know what memes are, right? We know this. Memes are the psychologist and sociologist who first coined that phrase, he said they're little units of culture that are passed from one person to the next with a symbolic meaning. So when you're scrolling on Instagram and you see a meme that makes you laugh, it's actually trying to teach you something. Like there's this one that was real popular recently. How many of you, this is going to be your world on Tuesday? I just had one question. We don't need a whole meeting with everyone for this now, right? And it's teaching you, don't be the one who asks the question. It's not really know what it's for, but Michael Scott just makes me laugh simply by putting up on screen. But it teaches us something. We are modeled for and we become imitators of that which gets rehearsed in front of us. When Savannah, my oldest, was about 2, I came around the corner in our living room. She was like this tall, and we had a couch, and she was standing at the couch. And as I walk around close so I can see it, she's got like a business card in her hand, and there's a gap between the cushions. And she's just standing there. Just imagine, she's like 2 years old, and she's just doing this. Swipe, swipe, swipe on the cushions. And I was like, how did this happen? Already, she was imitating what she had seen. Somebody. We learn and we are instructed through remembrance. Other reason that we need to choose to do it is so that we continue. We have to keep on. We have to continue to receive and experience the blessing of God. Look, Moses says in this, he's been telling them and speaking in the past tense, but look at the grammar, it changes. He says, remember the Lord your God, for it's he not who gave you the ability, but gives you the ability to produce wealth. See, we are meant to be people who receive the blessing of God, but then are conduits to send it off to somebody else. We're never meant to hold on to that blessing. And how many of you have seen, maybe in someone else's life, if you choose to dam up the river of resource that God gives, he will often turn the valve off. Because what he intends is for his people to be distributors. If you want to continue in this, you got to remember where it came from. That's what I love about how Moses is almost like a prophet. He's going, here's my bet. You're going to find God's blessing, and suddenly you're going to think it was you. And we've all done this. We've all prayed that prayer like, Lord, would you just help me get the job? And would you just help me pass this test? Some of you are praying that prayer right now before finals in the next 2 weeks. Just help me to remember it all, make this stick. I need your help. And what's going to happen to some of you is you'll get out of the test and you will look at your grade and you'll be like, man, I'm so good. It's almost like I have a photographic memory. I don't know. It's just amazing. I can't believe I nailed that. I closed that account. Did you see my prowess? Coffees for closers, bring it on, right? And we forget that 5 minutes ago you were shaking, asking God, if you don't show up, I'll never make it. We are such forgetful people. So he says, you got to continue in this way. Then he says, remember to avoid making the same mistakes. He says, you're going to get here, and I feel like, guys, you're going to forget me. And then you know what we're told? Like just a couple of decades later, the prophet Jeremiah, he writes to the people and he goes, here's what God says, my people have forgotten me. It's so common to the human. In order to avoid making the mistakes of the past, you've got to continually recall. And so then the last thing is that we have to unite, or we unite and we pass on this blessing from God to each other. We find camaraderie and unity in rehearsing and remembering what God has done. This experience happens for me a lot. My wife has a very large family, an extended family. And maybe you've experienced this too, where you start, like the first time you enter into a family that's not yours, like you're dating or you get engaged, and they sit around, like when Jessica and all of her sisters are together, they tell the same stories over and over and over again. You know what I'm talking about? It doesn't matter. We can see them 2-3 times a year, and the same stories come out. And they still laugh the same way. And everybody, it's like there's this shared bond that takes place when we recall something we experienced together. You know this? This is the same thing for the church. This is why we do it like this. It's why just like finding your church in the forest or at the ocean, I love that people are experiencing God in creation, but it is not the same as being gathered like this. God does something different, and it unites us in the community of faith, especially when we recall where he's been and what he's done. So as you choose to remember, you create bonds that aren't easily broken. Joshua, who came after Moses, said at the end of that generation, okay, Moses gave us the rules. Pass down the faith, don't forget. God's going to be faithful. And in Joshua 21:45, he says, not a single one of all the promises the Lord had given was left unfulfilled. Everything he spoke came true. God did his part. And you know what's tragic? Is that at the very end of that book, and as the book of Judges opens, talking about the next generation, it says, and then grew up a generation that did not know God. God did everything that he promised, and they missed it because they stopped remembering his goodness in the past. They didn't choose to remember. Next week, I'm going to start laying out for you our mission and vision, where we're going together as a church, where our elders and session and leaders have been praying into and seeking God about this. And I want to tell you what that is all about. And it's exciting stuff. I think God has incredible plans for our church. But one of the things that's got to happen for us to be anywhere near what God wants is for us as an intergenerational church to pass faith on well from one generation to the next. It's always one generation away from oblivion. You can always, without passing it down a good handoff from one to the next, it can be over. And that's super important for us. Any of you know what the Livermore light bulb is? Anybody in here know what the Livermore light bulb is? Hand? No? Okay, anybody know where Livermore, California is? I think that's where this is. It's close. Yay, all right. Livermore, California. In Livermore, there is a light bulb. It's called the Centennial, and it's been burning continuously since 1901. That's 122 years if you're not good at math. It's a long time for a light bulb. How many of you had a light bulb that just made it the last 6 months without burning out, right? That's a picture of it. It's hanging in a firehouse. And it was given to that firehouse in Livermore by somebody who hand blew the bulb, hand-blown glass. It's a 4-watt incandescent bulb. And they gave it to them so that in the middle of the night, when the alarm would go off, the firemen would be able to see to get around. So the light has been left on constantly. Here are the reasons why it's been going for this long. One, the seal on that glass bulb is so good that no air, nothing outside can get in to taint the purity of that filament. That's one reason. Another reason is because they don't turn it on and off. It just stays on. You know that whenever you turn the bulb in your house on or off, that surge of electricity every time can cause the filament to break. But they've maintained this for 122 years. There's now a generator for that one light bulb, and they have a backup generator to the bulb to make sure this never goes out. I think this is a great metaphor for our faith. That if we want to be able to hand it down to the next one, it has to stay pure. We have to protect it. It is so often that we want to mix and syncretize faith with all manner of worldview and ideology that comes in. And we're always tempted to forget what God's done before, what he said, and to kind of mix it up for our own good, and we got to protect it. But we also have to continue to keep it on. It can't have a stop-start. And what amazing thing would it be if this group of people, if we chose, like, not our families, we're going to hand it down. Well, I know God's in control of how the next generation receives, but what if you and I did everything we could to remember in front of them so that they catch the faith that they need? We need to remember what it took to get us here, who it was that got us here, his character, his promises, his faithfulness, his love, and then choose to not let the story end here. So here's what I want to ask you to do. I was thinking about, and this is, Jessica's such a great addition to all of my sermon planning. Basically, any good idea or illustration that happens in here was hers, just so you know. That way I don't have to footnote every sermon. It's just Jessica. But we were talking about how do you make this stick? And here's what I want to do. What if, how many of you guys keep your calendar on your phone? Like, that's your primary method. Most of you. Why don't you take your phone out right now? It's fine. It's church, but I'm giving you permission. Take out your phone. And if you don't, go ahead and make a note of this somewhere handwritten. And what if you just, every 28th of the month, for the next 12 months, June 28th, July 28th, August, you get the picture. Put an appointment, an event. Remember. And every 28th of the month, you stop and you just go, just for a moment, maybe the beginning of your day, maybe the end of your day, you just go, where has God been faithful in the last month? Where did I see him do something? Where did he answer a prayer? Where did he show up? When did I have that experience of his peace that I just couldn't have made up myself? Where did I see God? And then second, who needs to hear this story? See, if we build in a habit of looking for God's goodness and then telling who's next, you'll find, you know this to be true. Do you think that if we actually look for God's goodness, we'll see it? Because whatever you look for, you find. Right? You can look for disappointment, you'll find it. You can look for hopelessness all around. Or you can look for a God whose love and promise to you is everlasting, and you'll find it. And then when we tell somebody, I mean, it could be a grandson, a kid, it could be a coworker, it could be somebody who just is in a moment of doubt and despair, and you just go, can I tell you what God did this last month? I think that would be really, really cool. I know what some of you are thinking, though, right now. Like, I can kind of see it. There's a couple of skeptics who are like, what if God doesn't do anything? It's okay. Maybe it's a lot of you, because I get that. What if he doesn't show up? What do I do? Then, you know what you do? You just look back a little further. And you go back until you find a moment where he did what only God can do. And then you bring that to mind. And here's what I can almost guarantee you will happen. You will be amazed at how many things he's been doing around you that you just didn't notice before. And if you really feel like, I don't think God has ever come through for me, I don't think he's done anything that I could find, I'd love to talk to you as soon as we're done, because I got a story to tell you. Because about 2,000 years ago, he put on flesh. And he came, and he died, and he rose, and he said, I would love to give you this life, before you even knew it or could respond to it. So if nothing else, you got that. I just don't think it's going to take too much investigative power to find out how good he's going to be to us this next month.